Hello and welcome to the Catholic Mama podcast. I'm your host, Christine Flynn. Thanks for joining me on this episode where I'm also joined by the husband, Pat.
Hello, darling.
Hello. So this is funny. If you are just listening to the podcast instead of watching it, with Pat's constant annoyance and annoying insistence, I started doing video. And here we are. Mm-hmm. We're actually in different parts of the house. So if you're listening to this, you could go to YouTube and search for the Catholic Mama, and you would find my YouTube channel, and you could see Pat and I staring at each other from different parts of the house.
I'm in the basement.
It's a good place for you.
It's good. Yeah, keep me here. Yeah.
So we haven't been able to podcast together in a long while because our youngest is a Looney Tune and doesn't nap anymore. But she's asleep right now and it's still light out. So here we are podcasting for the first time in a long while.
I know. Mm-hmm. It's good.
It is good, even though we're in different rooms to do it. We're going to talk. We started off a while ago because somebody had given us a great idea on teaching to better teach children. How about you teach the adults the stuff that you want to teach your kids? Mm-hmm. It's a long way of saying that. So we started off by dismantling relativism. And we're going to continue on with the isms and do scientism today. Ooh. But before we start, did you want to you look like you had something to say?
No, for once, actually, I don't. I'm on the Catholic Mama podcast. This is a big deal for me. I'm very nervous. There's been a lot of anticipation for my return. So I just hope that we don't mess it up.
Okay. Okay. I think I don't know. When you were an atheist, would you also have classified yourself as a scientist? I don't know.
Yeah. So let's start with some definitions, right?
Sure. Distinctions.
Distinctions and definitions. Distinctions and definitions are a philosopher's love language. So I'm gonna woo you with these tonight. So when people first hear the term scientism, they think, oh, it must be related to science, and science is good, so this must be a good thing. But scientism, it doesn't translate to just science. What scientism is a more technical term that relates to, actually could relate to a couple of things, but it's a term that you find in philosophy for either in ontology or epistemology. And an ontology would be kind of a theory of things that exist, right? And epistemology is a theory of knowledge. Like, how do we know what we know? And what scientism says in any of its various forms will say that if we can't detect something through the scientific method, it doesn't exist. That would be the kind of ontological version of scientism, right? So if it doesn't come to us, say, through physics or chemistry, and like, different people in these camps, they don't even agree of what science something needs to come through ultimately to be real. But kind of the harder core scientism proponents, maybe physics or chemistry or something like that. Like, if physics and chemistry, if we can't reduce it to that, then it doesn't exist, right? Or it could be something about knowledge, of saying, like, if we can't know it through the scientific method, whether it's physics or chemistry, or say just what's sometimes called the hypothetico-deductive method in general, which is hypothesis form, empirical observation, hypothesis testing, that sort of thing. Then we just can't know it, right? Then it's just kind of, it's just beyond anything that we could know, right? So it's very important to make that distinction, because scientism isn't science; it's a philosophy. And so but our culture is very fond of science, and that's fine. Science is very good. It's very powerful. But sometimes people get confused when they first hear of scientism. But it is not something that we get from science, right? It's sort of a posture that certain philosophers take on what they think is the best way to view the world, or to talk about how we come to know things. So there. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So going back to you, several years back before you had converted, where did you fall? I'm just curious. I don't think we ever talked about this.
Yeah, no, I don't. No, I would not have ever considered myself somebody who was an advocate of scientism. I think, like most people who had naturalistic leanings, I thought that the sciences were very powerful, and they were an extremely important for advancements in technology, and they told us a lot of true things about the world, but they weren't exhaustive. And part of what started to veer me away from atheism, naturalism, was actually encountering many atheists and naturalists promoting scientism, and me just frankly seeing how ridiculous this was. And kind of wanting to distance myself from that. So, I mean, a good example would be morality, right? You have a number of atheists who are proponents of scientism, and they're essentially nihilists, right? They want to say that moral values, obligations, like these things are meaningless, right? Because they're not something that we can either detect, through the scientific method, or that we can know about really through the scientific method. So therefore, it's just not a part of reality, right? Whatever morality is, it's something we kind of project onto the world. It's not something we discover. And there's various atheists out there who happily accept a nihilistic outlook because of their commitments to scientism. So that would be like one aspect of the world that common sense people think is real. Like most of us think like, well, no, it seems like some things are really right and wrong. But if you assume this posture of scientism, you'll ultimately be led to probably thinking that we're all just profoundly deluded. So in fact, I guess in many ways, it was going deeper into these philosophies and finding them to be incoherent and ultimately self-defeating, which we'll talk about, that probably started to, I don't remember the exact step-by-step,
sure,
things that led me, to where I am now. But certainly, yeah, I don't think I would ever have said that I was one of those proponents. And I think I was probably always somewhat put off by it.
Interesting.
Because it's dumb.
As you say that, I'm pretty sure that at some point towards in the height, I don't know if that's the right word, of my atheism, I think I trended towards that.
Yeah, it's kind of a natural trajectory, but I want to be fair. Not all atheists are proponents of scientism. And many atheists are actually very critical of scientism. So even though they're often found together, one doesn't entail the other. So,
right.
Yeah, that's just worth pointing out, I guess.
Okay. Well, you're the expert when it comes to all this stuff. So where do we go from here in dismantling this? Like we worked on relativism a while back.
Yeah. Well, so I guess one thing that I would like to offer the gentle listeners of the Catholic Mama podcast is a good tool to use. And
your brain.
Your brain, and just trying to think. Good to use the brain and trying to think things through. And if something is trying to set a standard for essentially everything, right? I think it's always worth asking if that something meets its own standard. Like that's always a good tool to use. So I mean, like relativism is one of those interesting cases where, if somebody says that there is no such thing as truth, well, okay, well, let's see if we can make sense of that. And in sort of analyzing that statement, we realize that it kind of defeats itself, right? Because if it's true, then at least one thing is true. And if it's false, we don't need to pay attention to it. So, when people put out kind of bold philosophical claims, it's always just asking yourself, does this meet its own standard? And maybe it does, or maybe it doesn't. But also asking, does this ultimately undermine itself? Like if this turns out to be true, would it do damage to itself? Would it ruin itself like relativism does? And I think scientism is more of the former case, where what we'll realize is that depending on how one defines their scientism, and like I said, there's many different camps out there, there's going to be one or two things that is going to happen. It's either going to be trivial or it's going to be self-defeating. And what I mean by that is that it'll be trivial in the sense that if somebody kind of starts out by saying, yes, the only things that exist or the only things that we can know are those things that come through science, right? The science. And then you'll say, well, science seems to presuppose a lot of things, right? Like to even make sense of science, we need to presuppose logic, for example, right? Science Science doesn't prove logic. It uses logic. Mathematics, right? We also need to assume the reliability of our cognitive faculties and our sense perception. Like all those need to be reliable for science to give us anything reliable, right? So that needs to be assumed. Science can't prove that because it needs to assume it, right? I would argue science also assumes morality, interestingly enough, because we assume that scientists shouldn't lie about their lab reports and stuff like that, right? That's just another assumption. So science can't prove any of those things because you need those things to rely on anything that science gives you in the first place, right?
Sure.
So you might point that out to someone who promotes scientism, and what they might try and do then is just say, oh yeah, well, science is just all those things too, right? And then that's when it just becomes trivial. It's okay. Well, now philosophy is in and all a bunch of other stuff. So now we don't really have an issue, right? Because what kind of hardcore proponents of scientism want to do is they kind of want to restrict the domain of things that we can say exist or know about, really in a way that's going to exclude religion, right? I mean, that's what's going to be relevant for our audience, right? Which in a sense, a lot of what we know about God are from just kind of like philosophical arguments, right? That kind of work off the presuppositions that go into science. So if somebody can kind of restrict the domain of what we can say we can intelligibly talk about or know and kind of exclude all of that, then they might be able to try and undermine certain religious beliefs, right? But then you point out that that's not going to work, because what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to be so restrictive that science is going to lose its very foundations, right? You're not going to be able to make sense of science unless you accept the things like reliability of our cognitive faculties, philosophical presuppositions, morality, logic, mathematics, all those things, right?
What do proponents of scientism do? How do they treat all those issues, or do they not?
Well, yeah, I'm saying these are kind of like one of two ways that they might go about it. So one is, and I've literally had a conversation with somebody like this one time on my podcast, because I think he was kind of like a superficial level scientism-y proponent. And he said, yeah, like we can only know things through science. And I just kind of said what I said there, and he would just say, oh yeah, I just count all of that as science. And so I'm like, okay,
oh, I see.
Right?
Okay.
So like, okay, well, if that's what you mean, then there's not really going to be an issue here, or at least not for religious believers, right? Because we could still run the philosophical arguments for God. We can still talk meaningfully about morality. So that's why I say one option is just to make it trivial, and then we don't really have an issue, right? But then it's also just not interesting, right? We haven't drawn any clear boundaries about what science really is. So it's trivial in many different ways, right? But typically people who think about this a little bit more, they don't want to make it trivial. And so they do want to be more restrictive in it. But as soon as they do, I think it's going to become self-defeating. So if you want to say then, okay, the only things that we can know are those things that come through the hypothetico-deductive method, right? Hypothesis formation, empirical observation, and testing the hypotheses. The scientific method, right? Well, that statement itself, the only things we can know are that which come through the scientific method, is not itself something that comes through the scientific method. Right. So if you apply that standard to itself, it doesn't even meet its own standard. Right. So we have sort of a pretty profound self-defeat problem. Right. So if we could say, or you could try and so like clearly we can't know that then. Right. So if we can't know it because it didn't come through the scientific method, then conversation ends there. Right. It's not right. I don't know if that's true. Right. Right. Yeah. Because it doesn't mean it's like, if it was true, I couldn't even know it anyways type of thing. Right. So it's got a self-defeat problem. Or somebody might try and say, you should only believe that which comes through the scientific method. So now we're kind of making more of a normative statement, right? You should only believe that which comes through the scientific method. Well, that statement itself isn't something that comes through the scientific method. Right? So I shouldn't believe it then, because it didn't come through the scientific method, right? So my point here is, when you try and be more restrictive like that, then you have a self-defeat issue. Then it becomes sort of self-referentially incoherent. As soon as it starts to rev its engines, it almost immediately stalls out. And that's about, I think, all that really needs to be said about it. That's why I say it's like, it doesn't take much more than 5 minutes of more than the most superficial sort of reflection on these things to see that they have serious issues. And this is nothing new. I should say, actually, scientism is itself, just to give a little history of philosophy, it's sort of like a lingering mutation of other failed types of epistemologies or theories of meaning in the history of philosophy, right? So you kind of see these permutations, and what happens is things like this come up. They encounter all sorts of difficulties, like what I've just proposed, and then they actually collapse. So you had something called positivism, which was a very similar movement a while back. But you could even go back further and trace it back to a skeptical thinker named David Hume. And he had kind of a theory of epistemology, a kind of famous, well-known one that was called Hume's fork. And Hume's fork was the yeah, isn't that fun? Makes you hungry, doesn't it? But the idea where was, it would go something like this: like, if you can only know something in one of two ways, right? You can either know it as relations of ideas, and relations of ideas are the things we can kind of know a priori, right? That there are no unmarried bachelors, for example, right? Once you really understand the meaning of those terms, right? What a bachelor is.
You mean a married bachelor?
Yeah, sorry, there are no married bachelors. Yeah, sorry. I don't know the meanings of those terms, right? Right, or that 2 + 2 = 4, stuff like that, right? So if we can't know something either as a matter of relations of ideas, or as matters of fact, right? Just looking out into the world and just kind of seeing what happens, then we can't know it. But the problem is, again, it doesn't meet its own standard, because you couldn't know Hume's fork by either of those two categories, right? So if that's the case, then we can't know that that's true. Conversation is over yet again. So the point I'm making is that scientism isn't entirely new. There's been things that are very much similar to it that have come up. They've kind of imploded because of these internal inconsistencies. They've gone away, but then some type of weird permutation bubbles up.
You see this with heresies in the church.
Yeah, sure.
Everything old is new again. Is scientism on the rise since we have this unaffiliated? I mean, I know atheism is still relatively small in comparison to all the other belief systems. Where does scientism fall? Like, do you know? Is this something that's becoming, like, for listeners, will they be more likely now than had 5-10 years ago or earlier to encounter people with this mindset?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I had to take a guess, and I'm just guessing, I think it's probably waning. But it's still, of course, it still has a significant grip. So I guess it depends how you answer, like, among, like, professional philosophers and stuff like that. I think it's really waning, but on the popular cultural level, it's got a huge grip on people, right? And that's why, like, people think, like, whoever the scientists are, like, they're the high, and they're all popes, right? Proclaiming infallible dogma, right? With all respect to our Holy Father, of course. So I'd say on a popular level, I mean, it's got a crazy grip on people, even if they aren't really aware of, I guess, how it's discussed in among. Sure,
it might just be the esteem that they give to the sciences. And assuming what it can do without understanding what its limitations are. Yeah,
and there always kind of seems to be this lag too of, like, things, they kind of gain prominence in the academy, and it kind of, like, trickles down into the wider culture, but then things will kind of collapse, right, among our great intellectuals, if you want to call them that. But then culture will lag behind, pretty significantly for a while. So. Yep. Yeah, I would guess that I just don't know, because I haven't seen any recent surveys or anything on this. But my impression is scientism is people are recognizing that it's fraught with insoluble difficulties, and I think it's waning. And you have many atheists, like I said, many atheists who argue stringently against it. So it's not like it's just believers in God or theists or Catholics or something who have an issue with this. Many people who are completely secular have realized that this is just pretty much unworkable.
Okay. All right. So what else? Do you have any resources? Is there anything else that we need to say about scientism, or how to
Yeah, well, I think it's just important. Like, why does it matter? Maybe we should just cover that at the start. But I mean, it matters because I mean, a lot of the things that we think. I mean, apart from religious belief, a lot of the things that we assume to be the case about our lives, especially we already brought about morality, right? People who promote scientism want to try and undermine those beliefs, these often common sense beliefs. I think a very dangerous project that they're trying to do to undermine. But of course, I mean, it matters too, because it does ultimately bear in on questions of rational justification for religion, for belief in God, for historical investigations, obviously miracles, right? So if you take a position of scientism, or if somebody thinks scientism is true, they're going to think that like miracles are
off the table. Yeah.
Off the table. Right. So yeah, I mean, it just has those wider implications. So it is an enemy, not just because of those implications, but because it's false. So I think that's important. As far as resources, yeah, what would be some good books on this?
Before we started, I asked you to get the books.
I'm looking at my shelf here.
Well, okay. Yeah. In the meantime, though, you have a couple of articles from Catholic Answers, or that just went up on Catholic Answers, right? That deals with this. Okay.
No, that has nothing to do with this.
Oh.
My first one's about a crab. It's about a crab. I've got an article about.
I thought you said you had articles.
Yeah, I have my article about crabs. I thought that was nice. And then
a lot of people thought that was nice, honey. Don't sell yourself short.
Yeah, and then I've got an article on the problem of evil on Catholic Answers.
Okay, well, those both sound great.
Two recent ones. Yeah, scientism. Who would be some good on this? I mean, just there's so the problem is that there's not so few. There's so many people talking about it. I would say Ed Feser. Ed Feser's got some good stuff on this. He's got a good book, two good books. One is called Scholastic Metaphysics. He's got a good section working through scientism in there, showing all of its problems. Actually,
I think. I thought for a second that the computer was on top.
Yeah, it could be. It's a kind of a thick book, so it makes for a good stand.
It might be. Yeah.
Scholastic Metaphysics. If you're like seriously interested in diving deeper philosophically, that'd be a good one. And he's got a follow up to that called Aristotle's Revenge. So I would just say, just start with those two. That would be fine.
You know, it's funny. The other day, I started reading Aristotle's Revenge. It was on like
some leisure reading. Yeah, I mean that's a philosophy of nature book. That's pretty dense.
But you know what? Yeah, you know what though? At least in a lot of these books, because you know, philosophy and we don't get along like you two get along. I understood the introduction.
Well,
I'm making progress. I'll tell you what. If I didn't hear you talking so much about this stuff, I probably wouldn't have understood it. So it's seeping in. It's a slow.
Well, part of the reason I recommend Ed Feser is one, he himself used to be an atheist. He's now a Catholic, and he is also not a great philosopher. He's also a great writer. And that's a rare combination to find. Oftentimes you'll find people who are great thinkers and great philosophers, but poor writers. Other times you'll find great writers, but poor thinkers, poor philosophers. Ed has that unique ability to blend both great thinking and great writing. So
sorry, I'm yawning. It's not you.
Not boring.
I'm not. It's not you.
It's me.
It's not you. It's our babies.
Yes.
Okay. Well, for listeners, Aristotle's Revenge, at least the first 10 pages or so are very accessible.
It's a great 10 pages.
It's great. I don't know about the other 400, but
yeah, it's thick. I mean, he gets into philosophy of time. But it's
great. Oddly enough, because I don't know, maybe I need less sleep and then I'll understand this stuff. I was on the table while I hid in the dining room away from all the kids when I only got the 2 hours of sleep the other night. And I hid away to eat breakfast without anybody noticing me. And that book was on the table and I was so tired. I didn't want to just sit there and eat. I wanted to do something. And I wound up reading the book and I understood it.
Great.
On 2 hours of sleep.
Good.
So maybe I just need to like black out a little bit and then I'll understand philosophy more.
Yeah, because then you don't go into it so tense.
Yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe that's it.
Good.
Have a couple drinks before you start this book. Okay. Is that it?
That's all. Unless
okay.
They're supposed to be snack size episodes, right?
Oh, okay.
Is it?
I was going to put this up on my podcast too, not just on YouTube.
Oh, good.
So, well, okay. Then we have this. It's so odd to be talking to you not in the same room.
I can kind of hear you upstairs, and
I can kind of hear you. I can kind of hear you. Yeah. Well, let's real quick because can you explain, because you say this is about a crab, just real quick, if people didn't read this, where this crab article came from, Catholic, because you're funny, and then the article was funny.
Yeah.
But I don't want to spoil it for people because it's humor, the surprise is one of the funnier parts. So
sure. Well, thank you. It's so Catholic Answers. Sometimes they just send me assignments, I guess, and some biologist, atheist, I don't know who it was, on Twitter had a little video of a crab building a very impressive little structure in the sand, and he wrote in like funny letters like, "Oh, and you think humans are the most advanced species?" And,
is that how you read the alternating caps? And
yeah, how do you read it? Yeah, exactly. It's that. So I don't know. Whatever. So it's poking fun at anybody who gets the obvious notion that there seems to be an ontological superiority to humans.
Sure.
The problem is most people can't really articulate why. Yeah. So in that article, that's what I do. I bring in a great classical notion known as the hierarchy of being, and what it means to have metaphysical or ontological superiority. So we can say in a real way, actually, yeah, we are superior to crabs. They can still do cool things. That's true. And we're not, they're not splitting the atom or anything like that, but we have certain powers crabs do not have. And anyways, I won't spoil it. It's on Catholic Answers. I think the article is called, "Are You More Advanced Than a Crab?"
Yeah, that sounds about right. And then you have one on the existence of God and
resolving the problem. Yeah, resolving the problem of evil. I think they say how evil proves the existence of God, and it's kind of a novel take on the problem of evil. So I think people will like it, and if maybe we could do an episode on it sometime, because it's a little different than the usual way of going about it.
Yeah. Well, I've heard you explain it. It makes sense to me. But maybe I just had a couple drinks in me to relax enough to understand. Well, very good. Patrick, thank you for joining me from the basement.
Can I come up now?
No. I have the child lock on the basement door. So as soon as you figure that out, you can make your way up and do the dishes with me if you want. All right, everyone, thank you for joining us on this episode. One, subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening to it. Thank you. Leave a nice review, even better. Thank you very much. But also, since I just started this YouTube channel almost against my will, no, I'm kidding. Please come over to YouTube if you're not listening to that here. And if you are watching this on YouTube, thank you. Welcome. Nice to see you. Please subscribe as well. I think, Pat, I've joked about this because I had a total meltdown a couple weeks ago because I couldn't get the technology to work. Yeah, everybody nodding. And ever since then, anytime I start a project and I get frustrated by it, I want to throw up my hands. I say, God, you got to let me know if this is actually worth my while. Well, then every time after that, I wound up, a video kept coming up as like the default option on things. And suddenly I'm doing video when I didn't expect to. So God seems to want this. I hope I don't totally beef it, but here we are. All right. Thank you, everyone. Until next time.